In 2009, Trey Parker and Matt Stone aired an episode in which a cheerful bank teller took a $100 savings bond from a 10-year-old boy, described a chain of investments in a single breath, and then told the child the money was simply gone. The scene lasted about 20 seconds. The phrase it produced has lived on the internet for 15 years. That same episode traced a blender through 5 layers of American financial infrastructure before ending with government officials decapitating a chicken to decide economic policy. The episode won an Emmy. 2 years earlier, the actual American banking system had collapsed in a way that left millions of families with nothing, and nobody who ran the banks went to prison. Across nearly 3 decades, South Park has returned to banks, debt, inheritance, predatory finance, and the quiet machinery of money again and again, each time from a slightly different angle, each time landing somewhere that the actual financial press was not willing to go. Tonight, we are walking through all of it, slowly. Welcome to East Park. Let's get started. And it's gone. The Margaritaville banking scene and the 2008 collapse. There is a particular kind of scene in television that does not announce itself as important when it first airs. The scene is short. The scene is played for laughs. The scene does its work quickly and then the episode moves on, and the audience laughs and forgets the specific mechanics of what just happened because there was a funnier joke in the next scene. Years later, though, something strange occurs. The scene refuses to disappear. The scene migrates onto the internet. The scene appears in comment sections under news articles about bank failures. The scene gets embedded in Reddit threads every time a financial institution collapses. The scene becomes shorthand across a broad swath of the English-speaking internet for a specific feeling that most official financial journalism is not able to produce on its own. The feeling is the sensation of watching something that is supposed to be trustworthy reveal itself as theatrical. The feeling is the gap between the professional vocabulary of the institution and the actual outcome of any transaction with it. The scene aired on the 25th of March in 2009. It was the opening sequence of the 3rd episode of South Park's 13th season. The episode was called Margaritaville. The scene lasts from start to finish approximately 35 seconds. A father brings his 10-year-old son to a bank. The father, Randy Marsh, wants to teach the boy about saving money. The boy, Stan, hands the teller a $100 savings bond that his grandmother gave him. The teller, a young man named Benny, receives the bond with professional warmth. He explains, in the bright conversational tone of someone reading off a script they have rehearsed many times, what is about to happen to the money. It will be put into a money market mutual fund. The earnings from the fund will be reinvested in foreign currency accounts with compounding interest. The sentence has barely finished before Benny pauses and announces in the same warm professional tone that the money is gone. The bond is gone. The $100 no longer exists. Stan stares. The teller asks him to step aside for customers who actually have money with the bank. The joke lands so cleanly and so fast that most viewers laugh and move on. The setup is compressed into a single breath. The punchline arrives before the audience can brace for it. The rhythm is the rhythm of a magic trick. Watch closely. Now you see it, now you don't. The teller performs the same sequence on the next customer, and the customer after that, and on Randy himself when he storms up to the window to complain. Each time the outcome is the same. The money is gone. The line is always for customers who actually have money with the bank. The bank, in the 20 or so seconds of screen time it occupies before the episode's larger story takes over, has been rendered as an institution whose primary function is to be the last place the money was seen before it vanished. What the scene was depicting, in its compressed and absurdist form, was something that a significant portion of the American public had been trying to understand for the previous 18 months. The financial crisis of 2008 had begun, in its most visible early stages, with the collapse of the American subprime mortgage market. Banks and financial institutions had, across the previous decade, been extending mortgage loans to borrowers who could not sustain the payments, packaging those loans into securities, selling the securities to investors, and collecting fees at each stage of the chain. The underlying assumption was that housing prices would continue to rise, which meant that even if borrowers defaulted, the collateral would still be worth more than the loan. The assumption turned out to be wrong. When housing prices began to fall in 2006 and 2007, the value of the mortgage-backed securities fell with them. Institutions that had loaded their balance sheets with these securities began to fail. Lehman Brothers, one of the oldest investment banks in the United States, filed for bankruptcy in September of 2008. The federal government approved an emergency rescue package called the Troubled Asset Relief Program in October of the same year. By the time Margaritaville aired in March of 2009, the country had lost more than 2 million jobs in the previous 3 months alone, and the stock market was at its lowest point since the mid-1990s. Most people who had savings accounts or retirement funds had, by the spring of 2009 experienced some version of the sensation that the South Park scene was depicting. The money had been somewhere. Then it had not been somewhere. The explanation offered by the institution for why this had happened was long, technical, involved multiple layers of financial instruments the average depositor had never encountered before, and ultimately concluded that there was nothing to be done about it. The $100 savings bond had gone into a money market mutual fund, which had reinvested the earnings in foreign currency accounts, and now the money was gone. The formality of the explanation and the blankness of the outcome were the same whether the explanation came from an animated bank teller in a Colorado cartoon or from a real financial institution in a real letter to a real account holder. Trey Parker and Matt Stone, in interviews about the episode that aired in the weeks following the broadcast, were specific about what they had been trying to do and what they had deliberately chosen not to do. Matt Stone said in an interview cited across multiple outlets at the time that the show did not want to make an episode where it was simply a case of Wall Street taking people's money. Stone and Parker had, across the years leading up to 2009, consistently resisted the easy narrative frame of the powerful institution as the sole villain and the ordinary citizen as the passive victim. They wanted, in Margaritaville, to make something more uncomfortable. They wanted to implicate everyone. The bank teller scene was not designed to make the audience angry at the bank. The bank teller scene was designed to make the audience laugh at the absurdity of a system that everyone inside it accepted as normal. The teller was not presented as malicious. The teller was presented as pleasant, professional, and completely unbothered by the outcome. The money had gone through the proper channels and arrived at the proper destination, which was nowhere. This was, in the teller's experience, a routine transaction. The craft of the scene is worth spending a moment on because the speed is the argument. The writers made a specific decision to compress the investment chain into a single, unbroken sentence. The effect of this decision is that the audience cannot follow the sentence closely enough to evaluate any individual step. The money market mutual fund sounds reasonable. Foreign currency accounts with compounding interest sounds sophisticated. The sentence moves too fast for any single phrase to be examined before the next one arrives. And then the sentence ends and the money is gone. And the gap between the confident professional vocabulary and the catastrophic outcome has been made visible in a way that 3 hours of financial journalism cannot produce. The scene says in 35 seconds that the language of the institution exists to occupy the space where the explanation should be. The language is not the explanation. The language is what you hear while the explanation disappears. The scene became, in the years that followed the original broadcast, one of the most widely circulated pieces of economic comedy produced by any entertainment property in the 21st century. The phrase, "and it's gone," became a meme that migrated far outside the show's usual fan base. It appeared in news coverage of bank failures, including the failure of Silicon Valley Bank in March of 2023, which was, at the time, the largest American bank failure since the 2008 crisis. It appeared in coverage of cryptocurrency exchange collapses. It appeared as a shorthand across social media whenever a financial institution announced losses or a retail investor described watching a portfolio collapse in real time. The scene had become, across 14 years, a piece of cultural vocabulary for a specific experience that the population kept having and that the financial industry kept being unable to explain in terms that a 10-year-old could follow. What Parker and Stone had built in the opening minutes of a 22-minute cartoon was a diagnostic image precise enough to survive being applied to every subsequent financial crisis the country encountered. The diagnosis was not that banks are evil. The diagnosis was that the gap between what the institution says it is doing and what the outcome of that process actually is for the ordinary person who walks in the door is so wide that the only honest way to represent it is comedy. The teller is not lying. The teller is describing a real sequence of real financial operations that actually happened to the money. The money is genuinely gone. Both things are simultaneously true. And the combination of those two truths is funnier and more disturbing than either truth alone. The episode went on to do much more than the bank teller scene. It built around that scene one of the most structurally ambitious satires of the 2008 financial crisis that any American entertainment property would produce. But the bank teller scene was the first move, and it was the move that lasted longest in the culture, because it captured something that most serious analysis of the financial financial crisis was not able to capture. The serious analysis could explain the instruments. The serious analysis could trace the regulatory failures. The serious analysis could assign percentages of blame to various categories of actor. What the serious analysis could not do was reproduce the experience of standing at a bank window and being told by a pleasant young man who is still smiling that your $100 is simply gone now. South Park did that in 35 seconds. The Emmy the episode won was, in that specific respect, the right call. The question the rest of the episode was going to ask was what happens after the money is gone? Who explains it to the population? Who takes the blame? Who, if anyone, pays the cost? Those questions open into a much larger argument the episode was making about faith, sacrifice, and the particular religion that the American economy had been operating as for decades. And that argument, in the specific form the episode gave it, is worth taking apart carefully because it is one of the most honest things the show ever said about how the financial system actually works. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The Margaritaville bank scene compressed 15 years of financial crisis into 35 seconds, and the phrase it produced has never stopped circulating. But the episode had a second story running beneath the banking plot, one about a boy with a blender and an impossible chain of debt, and where that chain led was somewhere no financial regulator had ever been willing to go. Section 2, the Treasury Chicken, why South Park thinks financial experts are just guessing. There is a particular figure who appears in times of financial crisis across every form of media available to the public. The figure arrives on television. The figure appears in newspapers. The figure is quoted in emergency government statements and in front-page analyses by the most respected financial journalist in the country. The figure has credentials. The figure has a title. The figure works in a building that signals authority through its architecture alone. The figure speaks in a vocabulary that is specifically calibrated to convey precision, control, and the impression that the people inside the building are in possession of detailed knowledge about what is happening to the economy and what the correct response to that knowledge should be. The figure, when interviewed, does not appear flustered. The figure does not appear uncertain. The figure speaks in long, confident sentences about mechanisms and instruments and conditions and trajectories. The figure projects, above all else, the impression that the situation is being managed by people who understand it. South Park, in the second half of Margaritaville, decided to examine what was actually happening inside the building where those figures worked. The examination took the form of a subplot that the episode ran alongside the main plot involving Kyle's decision to absorb the town's collective debt. The subplot involved Stan Marsh and a blender. The blender was a Margaritaville brand frozen drink mixer that Randy had purchased on a payment plan. Stan, watching the economic crisis unfold around him, decided to return the blender as an act of household fiscal responsibility. What followed was one of the most precisely constructed pieces of satire about financial bureaucracy that the show had ever produced. Stan's journey began at Sur La Table, the upscale kitchen retailer where the blender had originally been purchased. The store clerk explained, with the same professional warmth that the bank teller had used in the opening scene, that the blender could not be returned because it had been purchased on a payment plan. The payment plan had been set up by a finance company. The finance company no longer held the debt. The debt had been packaged with other debts and sold to a larger financial institution. Stan would need to speak with that institution. Stan went to that institution. The same explanation was given. The debt had been moved again. He would need to speak with the next institution in the chain. The process repeated across several stops, with each institution describing in the same calm professional vocabulary how the original transaction had been transformed, repackaged, and sold further along a chain that grew longer and less legible with each step. This sequence was, in its underlying mechanics, an accurate description of how mortgage-backed securities and collateralized debt obligations had actually functioned in the American financial system in the years leading up to 2008. A homeowner took out a mortgage. The bank that issued the mortgage sold it to a larger institution. The larger institution bundled it with hundreds of other mortgages and created a security. The security was sold to investors. The investors sometimes sold their positions to other investors. The original mortgage, by the time the market collapsed, was often owned by an entity so far removed from the original lender that nobody in the chain could easily identify who held the ultimate liability. When homeowners defaulted and tried to negotiate with whoever held their mortgage, they frequently discovered that the identity of the current holder was genuinely unclear. The chain of ownership had become so long and so layered that the original transaction had dissolved into a kind of financial vapor, present everywhere in the system and traceable nowhere within it. Stan's journey to return the blender reproduced this experience at the scale of a kitchen appliance, which made it, paradoxically, easier to understand than most of the actual reporting on the subject. Stan eventually reached the United States Treasury. He had been directed there by the final institution in the chain, which had informed him that the mixer was currently valued at $90 trillion. The Treasury officials confirmed this valuation. Stan, bewildered, asked how that was possible. The officials told him they would need to consult the charts. Stan asked to see the charts. The officials were reluctant. Stan followed them anyway, through a corridor and into a chamber at the back of the building. The chamber contained a large circular board covering the floor. The board was divided into sections, labeled with different categories of financial action. The officials stepped up to the board. They decapitated a chicken. They released the headless chicken onto the board. One official played a version of the song Yakety Sax on a kazoo while the chicken ran its final path across the sections. The chicken eventually fell dead on the section labeled Bailout. The officials nodded gravely, confirmed the decision, and began preparing to issue another emergency intervention. Stan, watching all of this, destroyed the blender and left. The scene is, in its surface reading, straightforward absurdist comedy. It takes the formal vocabulary of official financial decision-making, the grave consultations, the charts, the process, and replaces the mechanism with a headless chicken and a kazoo. The effect is immediate and clear. The people running the financial system do not know what they are doing. The charts are not real charts. The decision-making is randomized. The gravitas is performance. The outcome of the consultation is determined by an animal running in circles after its head has been removed. The deeper reading, however, is slightly more precise than the surface reading suggests. The episode was not arguing that the Treasury officials were stupid or malicious. The episode was arguing that the complexity of the financial system had exceeded the genuine understanding of the people tasked with managing it. This is a specific and substantive claim. The financial crisis of 2008 produced an enormous amount of analysis about fault, about greed, about deregulation, about the specific decisions made by specific people at specific institutions. Much of that analysis was well-grounded and important. But underneath all of it was a more uncomfortable observation that fewer commentators were willing to make directly, which was that the financial instruments at the center of the crisis were genuinely too complex for the regulatory apparatus to understand in real time. The ratings agencies that had given mortgage-backed securities top safety ratings had not done so purely out of corruption, though corruption was present. They had done so, in part, because the models they were using to assess the instruments were based on assumptions about housing price behavior that had never been stress-tested against a genuine national housing market collapse. The Federal Reserve, which is literally the entity whose job it is to understand the American economy, had not anticipated the scale of the collapse. Ben Bernanke, the Fed chairman at the time, had stated publicly in 2007 that the problems in the subprime mortgage market seemed likely to be contained. The problems were not contained. The chicken landed on Bailout. Parker and Stone had, in building this scene, made a choice that most mainstream commentary about the crisis was not willing to make. The choice was to treat the incomprehension of the financial authorities not as a failure of specific individuals, but as an inherent feature of a system that had grown too complex to be governed by the people nominally in charge of governing it. The chicken is not a commentary on the intelligence of Treasury officials. The chicken is a commentary on the relationship between the formal vocabulary of financial authority and the actual epistemic situation of the people using that vocabulary. The vocabulary implies knowledge. The knowledge is not reliably present. The gap between the two is the gap the headless chicken runs through. Stan, having watched the chicken fall on Bailout, throws the blender onto the board and walks out. The gesture is the right one in the emotional logic of the scene. The return has failed. The chain of ownership led to a building where a chicken decides the fate of the global economy. There is no further step to take. The blender is worth $90 trillion in some formal sense that no actual human transaction will ever redeem. The transaction that created the debt has been so thoroughly laundered through layers of financial infrastructure that the original blender and the original $100 and the original $100 savings bond have all become something that exists on spreadsheets and in fund portfolios and in government ledgers without any of those representations having any connection to the physical objects that set the chain in motion. The actual bailouts that the episode was responding to had, by the time the episode aired, already been decided. The Troubled Asset Relief Program had been signed into law by President Bush in October of 2008. The Obama administration had taken office in January of 2009 and was in the process of designing additional stimulus and stabilization measures. The decisions about which institutions to save, how much to spend, and on what terms had been made in a series of emergency consultations among a relatively small group of people under conditions of extreme time pressure and limited information. The episode acknowledged this implicitly. The officials in the Treasury chamber were not taking their time. The chicken sequence was quick. A new crisis was already being reported from the next room before the current one had been resolved. The pace was the pace of the actual crisis management, which had involved decisions of enormous consequence being made faster than anyone involved was fully comfortable with. The episode also delivered, in the Treasury sequence, a piece of commentary about the relationship between financial authority and public accountability that most official coverage was reluctant to produce. The chicken is behind a door. The public does not know it is there. Stan only discovers it because he refuses to accept the official account and follows the officials through the corridor. The scene is, in this reading, about transparency. The formal process, the charts, the solemn consultations exists in the public space. The actual mechanism, the randomized outcome of a post-mortem animal's final movements, is in the back room. The public face of financial governance is designed to project competence. The back room is where the competence actually lives. Stan gets to see the back room because he keeps asking a simple question and refusing to accept the answer that the institution provides at each step. The answer at each step is designed to redirect him to the next step rather than to explain anything. The explanation, when he finally reaches it, is that there is no explanation. There is just the chicken. What the episode understood and depicted was that the population of the United States had been living for decades in a relationship with its financial institutions that was based on a performance of expertise rather than on actual expertise. The performance was very good. The buildings were impressive. The vocabulary was dense and specific. The titles were serious. The dress code was correct. All of the visible signals of competence were present and maintained with consistent professionalism. The actual capacity of the institutions to understand and manage the systems they were operating was a different matter, and the 2008 crisis had made that difference visible in a way that the previous decades of growth had been able to conceal. South Park, in the Margaritaville Treasury sequence, did not editorialize about this. The show simply showed the chicken and let the audience draw its own conclusions. The chicken landed on bailout. The bailout happened. The banks that had created the instruments that failed were, in most cases, rescued rather than dissolved. The executives who had run those institutions during the period of maximum risk were, in most cases, not prosecuted. The regulatory framework that had allowed the crisis to develop was reformed, but not abolished. The vocabulary of financial expertise continued to be spoken in the same confident tone by the same category of official in the same kind of building. Stan walked home. Randy bought a new blender. The new model had a salsa dispenser. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The Treasury chicken showed that the people managing the financial system were guessing, and that the formal vocabulary of expertise was the curtain in front of the randomized outcome. The next section moves to a different corner of the same system, one where the money that survives the bank goes on to meet the government, the courts, and the specific financial machinery that waits for anyone who tries to hold on to inherited wealth in a country that has strong opinions about what should happen to it. Section 3. The IRS comes for Cartman Land. Taxes, inheritance, and the state as financial predator. There is a particular fantasy that sits near the center of the American economic imagination. The fantasy involves a sudden arrival of money. The money does not come from work. The money does not come from a salary or a business or a careful accumulation across decades. The money arrives all at once, from outside the normal channels, in a form that feels like a gift from the universe rather than a transaction with it. The fantasy takes different shapes in different people. Sometimes it is a lottery ticket. Sometimes it is a real estate windfall. Sometimes it is a stock that multiplied overnight. But one of the oldest and most persistent forms of the fantasy is the inheritance. The inheritance is money that was always going to arrive eventually. The inheritance is money that somebody else earned and that the recipient did nothing to deserve and nothing to lose. The inheritance is, in the fantasy version of itself, money that belongs entirely to the person who receives it, free of any prior claim, clean of any obligation, available for whatever purpose the recipient chooses. The fantasy is powerful precisely because it appears to offer a version of wealth that has been stripped of the conditions that normally accompany it. Ordinary wealth accumulation requires time, which most people have less of than they want. It requires discipline, which most people maintain imperfectly. It requires access to systems, education, professional networks, investment vehicles that are not equally available to everyone. The inheritance sidesteps all of this and arrives fully formed. It does not require the recipient to have done anything in particular to deserve it, which is both its moral problem and its emotional appeal. The person who receives an inheritance is, in the moment of receiving it, exempt from the normal relationship relationship between effort and reward that the culture otherwise insists upon. The exemption feels like freedom. The exemption is, in almost every case, temporary. South Park examined this fantasy on the 25th of July in 2001. The episode was the 6th of the 5th season. It was the 71st episode of the series overall. It was written by David R. Goodman and directed by Trey Parker. It was titled Cartman Land. The premise was simple, and the execution was, in Parker's own words from the DVD commentary, almost too easy. Eric Cartman's grandmother dies. Her name was Mabel Cartman. She leaves her grandson $1 million in her will. The rest of the family gathered at the reading of the will receives nothing. They are listed in the document, acknowledged in the document, and then bypassed in the document in favor of Cartman, who has done nothing to earn the money, and who, in the estimation of everyone who has watched the show for any length of time, represents almost exactly the kind of person who should not be given $1 million. The family reacts to this outcome with outrage. Cartman reacts to it with the particular satisfaction of someone who has always believed the universe owed him something and has just received confirmation. The episode is not, in its first act, primarily a satire about financial systems. It is a character piece, and a very good one. Cartman's relationship to the $1 million establishes, more clearly than almost any previous episode had done, something essential about how he relates to money and what he believes money is for. He does not want to invest it. He is not interested in growing it. He does not have ambitions about building a business or funding a project. What Cartman wants to do with $1 million is remove himself from the inconvenience of other people. He wants a place where he alone decides who is allowed in. He wants to be free of the experience of waiting in lines, of sharing space with strangers, of being subject to the social negotiations that all shared public spaces require. He wants, in the plainest terms, to purchase sovereignty over a small territory. The specific territory he settles on is a failing amusement park called North Park Funland. He buys it from its owner, Frank Fun, who warns him that the park has been a financial failure. Cartman does not care about this. He renames the park Cartman Land. He closes it to the public. He goes on the rides alone. This is a precise portrait of a specific relationship to money that the show had not depicted with this level of clarity before Cartman Land. What Cartman is describing, when he describes his intentions for the inheritance, is money as a mechanism for the elimination of social friction. He is not interested in the productive or generative possibilities of capital. He is not interested in what the money can build or enable or multiply. He is interested in what the money can wall off. The $1 million in his design is a barrier between himself and the parts of ordinary life that he finds intolerable. The park is not an investment. The park is a moat. The rides exist not because Cartman enjoys the rides in any particular way, but because the rides are the things that other people want access to. And controlling that access is itself the pleasure. The psychological precision of this portrait is worth dwelling on because it describes something that economic analysis has historically been poorly equipped to capture. Standard economic models tend to treat consumer behavior as utility maximization. The rational actor acquires resources in order to consume goods and services that produce satisfaction. The more resources the actor has, the more satisfaction the actor can purchase. Cartman's relationship to his $1 million does not fit this model at all. He is not trying to maximize satisfaction through consumption. He is trying to maximize exclusion through ownership. The satisfaction he seeks is not the pleasure of the rides themselves. He can go on the rides alone, and he does, but the episode makes clear that the rides are not really the point. The point is knowing that nobody else is on them. The point is the wall. The money, in his application of it, is not a medium of exchange. The money is a mechanism for the construction and maintenance of a boundary. This is a relationship to wealth that exists in the real world and that most economic frameworks are not designed to describe, but that South Park captures with a single episode about a 10-year-old boy and a failing amusement park. The fantasy begins to encounter reality almost immediately. The security guard Cartman hires to keep everyone else out refuses to work for free rides as payment. The guard wants a salary. Cartman, who has spent his entire inheritance on the purchase of the park, has no cash remaining. The guard will work if Cartman lets 2 paying visitors in per day. The fee from 2 visitors will cover the guard's wages. Cartman, who had not thought through the operating costs of running a physical facility, has no choice but to agree. 2 people are let in. Then a ride breaks down and maintenance costs require more visitors to be admitted. Then utilities become a problem, and refreshments, and the accumulating costs of running a facility that was already, in Frank Fun's estimation, a financial failure before Cartman bought it. The park fills up. The lines return. Cartman finds himself surrounded again by exactly the people he spent $1 million to to escape, now paying $29.95 a head to be there, which the financial press inside the episode's world promptly declares to be a brilliant piece of reverse psychology marketing. Parker and Stone built the financial education into the comedy without labeling it as financial education. What the Cartman Land arc teaches, in the process of making the audience laugh, is a precise lesson about the relationship between capital and operating costs. Cartman's fundamental mistake was treating the $1 million as a pool of value rather than as a starting position in an ongoing financial relationship. The money bought an asset. The asset required maintenance. The maintenance required revenue. The revenue required customers. The customers required the thing Cartman most wanted to avoid, which was other people. The chain from purchase to crowded park is not a narrative accident. It is the actual logic of capital-intensive assets compressed into 22 minutes of cartoon comedy. You cannot own a facility without incurring costs. You cannot cover costs without revenue. You cannot generate revenue without service delivery. Service delivery, almost by definition, involves other people. Cartman's fantasy of sovereign ownership dissolved the moment it had to interface with the actual operating requirements of the thing he had purchased. What makes the operating cost sequence particularly effective as financial education is the way it demonstrates the compounding nature of capital commitments. Cartman's first operating cost is the security guard. That cost is manageable. 2 visitors per day covers the guard's wages, but the introduction of the first cost creates the conditions for the second cost, because visitors using the rides creates wear on the equipment, which creates maintenance obligations, which require more revenue, which requires more visitors. Each additional cost requires the admission of more paying customers, which generates more wear, which generates more maintenance costs, which requires more customers still. The escalation is not dramatic. It is quiet and steady and completely indifferent to Cartman's wishes. The park that was supposed to be empty fills up because the economics of ownership are not compatible with the economics of exclusion. You cannot maintain an asset for one person without creating the conditions that make maintaining it for one person financially impossible. This is not a principle that requires advanced knowledge of financial systems to grasp, but it is a principle that most people encounter only through the expensive experience of discovering it personally. South Park gave it to the audience in the form of a fat child on a roller coaster, which is a more efficient delivery mechanism than most finance textbooks. Then the IRS arrives. Cartman has not been keeping tax records. This is not surprising. He is a 10-year-old child with no prior experience of business ownership or tax law, but the IRS does not regard youth as a mitigating factor. The episode reveals in its final minutes that Cartman owes taxes on the income the park generated during the period it was operating profitably. The IRS seizes the park and all of the money it produced. When the full accounting is completed, Cartman does not break even. He ends the episode with a debt of approximately $13,000, over and above whatever he managed to recover from the sale of the park back to its original owner. He entered the episode with $1 million. He exits the episode in the red. The IRS intervention arrives in the episode without build-up and without warning, which is precisely how it tends to arrive in actual life for people who have not been anticipating it. The episode does not introduce tax obligations as a concept earlier in the plot and then follow through on them in the conclusion. The taxes simply appear as a consequence of a business activity that Cartman did not understand he was conducting under the observation of a tax authority that had been watching the whole time. This is a specific and accurate rendering of how tax liability works for people who encounter it for the first time through a windfall or a new business activity rather than through the gradual accumulation of ordinary wage income. The person who has always had taxes withheld from a paycheck has a managed, mediated relationship with the tax authority. The person who suddenly finds themselves in possession of a large sum of money from an unusual source, an inheritance, a lottery win, a business that became profitable faster than expected, has a different kind of relationship. The tax authority does not announce itself until it is ready to collect. The collection, when it arrives, is comprehensive. This outcome is, in the show's internal logic, played entirely for comic satisfaction. Kyle, who has spent the episode hospitalized and losing his faith in God over the injustice of a terrible person receiving a windfall, recovers his faith the moment he learns that Cartman's money is gone. The episode resolves around the idea that the universe has corrected itself. The bad person did not get to keep the good thing. The financial machinery of the state took the money back. Kyle leaves the hospital. Order is restored. The scene is warm and funny, and the audience is invited to feel that something just has occurred. But the episode is also, underneath that satisfaction, asking a question it does not answer directly. The IRS that takes Cartman's money is not depicted as a heroic institution. The IRS does not arrive in the episode as a guardian of public welfare. The IRS arrives as a collection mechanism. It takes what is owed. It takes it completely. It takes it past zero, into debt. The institution that removes the the ill-gotten gain is not distinguishable in its methods or its affect from the institution that generated the ill-gotten gain in the first place. Both are impersonal. Both operate according to rules that the person on the receiving end did not write and cannot negotiate. Both produce outcomes that are technically correct under the applicable framework and practically devastating to whoever is standing in their path. The show is careful not to resolve this ambiguity in either direction. The audience is allowed to feel satisfied that Cartman lost the money, and the satisfaction is genuine and well-earned within the episode's moral logic. But the mechanism that produced the satisfaction is not a moral mechanism. The IRS did not take the money because Cartman is a bad person. The IRS does not have a mechanism for assessing the character of the people it pursues. The IRS took the money because the money was owed under the applicable tax code, and Cartman had failed to pay it. The same mechanism that produced the satisfying outcome in this case would produce the same outcome for someone who received an inheritance honestly, ran a business earnestly, failed to maintain adequate records through ignorance rather than negligence, and found themselves at the end of the process in a position of financial liability they had no way to have anticipated. The justice Kyle experiences at the end of the episode is real justice within the story. The mechanism that delivered the justice is indifferent to whether justice is what it is delivering. This is a more complex observation than the comedy surface suggests. American political culture has a long tradition of treating the inheritance tax as a moral battleground. On one side is the argument that inherited wealth, passed without limit from one generation to the next, concentrates power and capital in ways that undermine the stated values of a democratic society. On the other side is the argument that the money was already taxed when it was earned, and that the government's claim on it at the moment of its transfer to a new owner is a form of double taxation that punishes the productive and rewards the imprudent. South Park, in Cartman Land, does not take either side of this debate directly. The show does not endorse the IRS. The show does not defend Cartman's right to keep the money. The show depicts the financial machinery operating on a person who encountered it unprepared, and allows both the comedy of the outcome and the slight chill of the mechanism to coexist. What the episode established in 2001 was a template for how the show would think about the relationship between individuals and financial institutions going forward. The template was that the institution, whether a bank or a tax authority or a legal system, is not a moral actor, it is a machine. The machine operates according to its own logic. The person who encounters the machine unprepared will lose. The person who encounters the machine prepared may win, or may lose, but will at least understand what happened to them. Cartman lost because he did not understand the machine. The machine was not cruel. The machine was not kind. The machine processed his inheritance through its standard procedures and returned him to a condition of financial liability. The machine did not know his name. The machine did not care about his grandmother. There is a broader observation buried in the episode's final sequence that the show delivers without underlining it. Cartman sells the park back to its original owner for his original purchase price, or something close to it. The sale produces a sum of money. The IRS takes the entire sum plus an additional amount. The lawyers who facilitate the collection take their fees from whatever remains. The security guard who is employed at the park is owed back wages that are added to the liability. Kenny's family is owed damages for Kenny's death on the premises, which adds another line to the total. By the time all of the institutional claims against the money have been satisfied, there is nothing left for Cartman and a remaining debt of $13,000 that he will presumably carry for years. The sequence in which all of these claims are presented and processed takes approximately 90 seconds of screen time. In those 90 seconds, $1 million disappears into the machinery of institutions that each have a legitimate claim to a portion of it, and the person whose name was on the original check ends the process owing more than he started with. The speed of the sequence mirrors the speed of the bank teller scene 4 seasons later. The money is there, now it is gone. The machinery moves on. There is a line in the episode, delivered by one of the lawyers collecting the IRS debt, that the show drops without comment. When the money is taken, a lawyer mentions, almost as an aside, that a portion of the debt relates to the death of a child in the park. The child, of course, is Kenny, who dies in some manner in every episode. The lawyer says the boy dies all the time. The other lawyer agrees. They continue with the paperwork. The legal system is not interested in the recurring nature of the death. The legal system has priced it it as a liability. The liability is added to the total is collected, the machine moves on. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Cartman Land showed the financial machinery consuming an inheritance from both ends, first through operating costs and then through the state. The next section moves to a different kind of extraction, one aimed not at children with million-dollar windfalls, but at elderly people with credit cards and fading memories. Section 4. Cash for gold, shopping networks, and the elderly as profit margin. There is a particular hour of the day that the American home shopping industry discovered, over many years of data collection and audience analysis, to be its most productive. The hour is not prime time. The hour is not the weekend morning block when families are gathered around televisions together. The hour is the one that sits in the quiet middle of the afternoon on a weekday, when the people watching television are predominantly older, predominantly home alone, and predominantly without the social infrastructure that might provide a second opinion before a credit card number is entered. The industry discovered that this hour produced conversions at a rate that other hours could not match. The industry built its programming around this hour. The industry refined its hosts, its camera angles, its pricing language, and its call to action sequences across decades of careful observation of what worked during this specific window of time. The industry became, in the process, extremely good at selling things to a demographic that was sometimes lonely, sometimes cognitively impaired, and almost always operating without any external check on a purchasing decision that felt, in the moment, like a connection rather than a transaction. South Park, on the 21st of March in 2012, decided to examine this industry at length. The episode was the second of the 16th season. It was the 225th episode of the series overall. It was written by Trey Parker. It was titled Cash for Gold. The episode was the show's first sustained engagement with a specific category of financial predation that targeted elderly people not through complexity or institutional opacity, but through emotional manipulation deployed by a medium most people thought of as passive entertainment. Television, in the episode's framing, was not just showing things to people. Television was selling to people who had been selected by the industry because their circumstances made them easier to sell to. The episode opens on a family visit. Stan Marsh and his parents are visiting Stan's grandfather Marvin at the retirement home. The visits are, in the canon of the show, always slightly awkward. Marvin, whose age the show has never pinned down precisely, but who is clearly in advanced old age, has difficulty with names. He calls Stan Billy. He always calls Stan Billy. He has been calling Stan the wrong name for as long as the show has depicted the two of them together. The name confusion is played for gentle comedy in most of its appearances. In Cash for Gold, it becomes something slightly more complicated, because the name confusion is connected to something that is being done to Marvin by an institution that depends on exactly this kind of confusion to function. Marvin has a gift for Stan. The gift is a bolo tie. The tie is, by his account, extremely valuable. He purchased it from a shopping network called the Jewels and Gems Shopping Network, which he refers to by the familiar shorthand of someone who watches the channel regularly and considers its host a kind of companion. The host's name is Dean. Dean told Marvin that the bolo tie contains 14-karat gold and genuine diamonds and is worth approximately $6,000. Marvin paid something approaching that amount. He is giving the tie to Stan as a gesture of love and generosity. He wants his grandson to have something valuable. The gift is, in Marvin's internal experience, an expression of care across generations. The tie is the concrete form that his affection has taken. Stan, confronted at school by Cartman with mockery about the tie, takes it to a Cash for Gold store to sell it. The store offers him $15. Stan goes to another Cash for Gold store. The second store offers him less. He takes it to a third establishment, which turns out to be a Taco Bell that has added a Cash for Gold window to its operations and offers him a 7-layer burrito in exchange. The gap between the $6,000 Marvin paid and the $15 the resale market will offer is the entire subject of the episode compressed into a single economic data point. The object is not worth what the channel said it was worth. The channel knew it was not worth what the channel said it was worth. The channel sold it to Marvin anyway because Marvin was the kind of customer the channel had been designed to reach. Cartman, who processes this information differently than Stan does, identifies in the situation not a moral problem, but a business opportunity. He explains to the boys, with the clarity of someone who has found an elegant formula, the economic structure of the operation. The formula he writes on a whiteboard involves Cash for Gold stores, old people, and cable shopping networks, combined in the correct sequence. The equation produces gold. Cartman launches his own own version of the channel called the Old People's Shopping Network, and his own program titled Eric's Jewelry Cavalcade with Eric. He begins selling cheap jewelry to elderly viewers using the same techniques Dean uses. He tells his customers they are getting extraordinary value. He tells them each piece is a limited offering. He tells them at the close of each sale that they are frankly robbing him at this price. The show then delivers in a montage that is built around a cheerful a cappella song modeled on the FedEx advertising jingle of the period, the structural revelation of how the entire market works. The jewelry is manufactured in India. It is shipped to American shopping networks. The networks sell it to elderly viewers at prices many times its actual value. The elderly viewers give the jewelry as gifts to children and grandchildren. The children and grandchildren take the jewelry to cash for gold stores. The cash for gold stores sell the gold to smelting companies. The smelting companies melt the jewelry into raw gold. The raw gold is shipped back to India, where it is used to manufacture new jewelry. The cycle is complete. The gold moves in a circle. The money moves in one direction only, from the bank accounts of elderly people into the operating revenues of the shopping network, the smelting company, the shipping infrastructure, and the manufacturing facility. The elderly person's $6,000 entered the system and became $15 of resale value and a circling supply chain. Nothing was created, nothing was destroyed. The money transferred. What the montage makes visible is a system that does not have a single identifiable villain in the way that satisfying moral narratives usually require. Stan, traveling through the supply chain looking for the person responsible, arrives at each node to find someone who can reasonably point to the next node as the actual source of the problem. The shopping network blames the cash for gold stores for buying merchandise that the network insists has genuine value. The cash for gold stores explain that they are simply offering market price for the goods brought to them. The smelting company is processing material it has legitimately purchased. The manufacturer in India is filling orders from clients who have placed legitimate purchase orders. At every point in the chain, the participant can accurately describe their own role as a normal commercial transaction. The predatory structure only becomes visible when you look at the chain as a whole rather than at any individual link within it. This is precisely why it persists. No single actor in the chain is breaking any law. No single actor can be identified as the point of failure. The failure is the design itself. Dean, the host of the Jules and Jim's shopping network, is the episode's most developed character outside of the main cast. He is depicted in the visual grammar the show uses for people who have crossed the line that the show takes seriously, which is the grammar of someone who knows what he is doing and has constructed a professional persona thick enough to allow him to continue doing it. Dean has a voice for the camera, and a face for the camera, and a language for the camera, and none of them are what he actually is. What he actually is, in Stan's assessment, is a man who has located a vulnerable population and built a career extracting money from it. Stan calls him and tells him to kill himself. The call is unprompted and direct and strips away the entire professional vocabulary Dean operates behind. Stan is not offering an argument. Stan is not presenting evidence. Stan is making a moral verdict. The verdict is that Dean knows what he is doing, has always known what he is doing, and has chosen to continue doing it, and that the only appropriate response to this choice is the one Stan is offering. Dean, in the final minutes of the episode, does exactly what Stan has been telling him to do. He is not driven to it by Stan alone. 3 elderly viewers have been calling him with the same message, each one stating in calm, measured tones that Stan was right and that Dean should act accordingly. The final caller, when Dean attempts to escalate by telling her he has a gun, simply tells him to put the barrel to his temple and pull the trigger. Dean does. The jewelry carousel continues to rotate. The gold continues to circle. The episode was, in its cultural moment, responding to a specific real-world phenomenon that had become increasingly visible in the years following the 2008 financial crisis. The cash for gold industry had expanded dramatically during and after the crisis, with shops opening in strip malls and storefronts across the country as ordinary people looked for ways to convert household assets into cash during a period of widespread economic stress. The expansion of the industry had been accompanied by a parallel expansion of home shopping network programming aimed specifically at the elderly. Federal regulators had, by 2012, begun publishing advisories about the exploitation of elderly consumers through shopping networks and telephone sales operations, noting that cognitive decline and social isolation made older viewers significantly more susceptible to high-pressure sales techniques. The episode did not cite these advisories. The episode depicted their subject matter in a way that made the advisories feel, by comparison, like understatement. What South Park understood about the cash for gold economy was something that the regulatory language of consumer protection section struggled to articulate without sounding either condescending or helpless. The problem was not that the elderly viewers were stupid. Marvin is not stupid. Marvin loves his grandson and wants to give him something valuable. The problem was that the channel had been built with considerable professional skill to meet a real emotional need in a way that extracted money in exchange for the meeting. The loneliness that made the afternoon programming window so productive was a real loneliness. The connection the viewer felt with Dean during the broadcast was a real feeling, even if the feeling was being manufactured deliberately. The $6,000 bolo tie was, in Marvin's internal experience, proof that he had someone to give something to. The channel had turned that proof into a transaction. The transaction had cost him $6,000 for a piece of jewelry worth $15,000. The emotional experience was real. The financial product was not. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Cash for Gold mapped a complete predatory loop aimed at elderly consumers and found that the loop had no single villain, only a design. The next section turns back to the 2008 crisis and the question of who, in South Park's reading, actually absorbs the cost when the whole system fails. Section 5, Kyle as Christ, debt forgiveness, sacrifice, and who actually pays. There is a particular moment in the history of any financial crisis when the conversation shifts. The shift happens after the initial shock, after the first wave of news coverage about collapsed institutions and vanishing savings, after the public has absorbed the basic outline of what went wrong. The shift is the moment when the question changes from what happened to who pays for it. The two questions sound related, but they are not the same question. The first question is diagnostic. The first question has a technical answer, or several technical answers, that economists and journalists and regulators can argue about in peer-reviewed papers and congressional testimonies and newspaper op-eds for the better part of a decade. The second question is moral. The second question does not have a technical answer. The second question asks something that the financial system does not have a formal mechanism for deciding, which is whether the cost of a collective failure should be distributed across the entire population or concentrated in the hands of whoever can be identified as most responsible. The second question, in the American context, has almost never been answered in a way that satisfied the majority of the people affected. The cost tends to land on the people who were least responsible for generating the crisis and least equipped to absorb its consequences. South Park in Margaritaville built an entire second narrative thread around this question. The thread ran alongside the banking plot and the treasury plot and was, in the episode's structural design, the one that carried the most emotional weight. The thread involved Kyle Broflovsky. Kyle, in the canon of the show, occupies a consistent moral position. He is not the most conventionally powerful character. He is not the smartest in the technical sense that Cartman is often operationally cunning. Kyle is the character who cares about whether things are right. He is the character who objects when the group is moving towards something wrong. He is the character whose discomfort with injustice is, in the show's internal language, the signal that injustice is actually present. Kyle functions across the run of the show as the moral barometer. When Kyle is distressed, something genuinely worth being distressed about is happening. In Margaritaville, Kyle is distressed by the economic crisis in a specific way. He is not distressed by the complexity of the financial instruments or by the specific failures of the regulatory apparatus. He is distressed by the explanation that has taken hold among the townspeople of South Park, which is Randy's explanation, and Randy's explanation is a religious one. Randy has told the town that the economy is failing because people have sinned against it through reckless spending. The economy is angry. The economy demands sacrifice. The economy must be appeased through austerity and penitence and the demonstration of correct financial behavior. This explanation has, by the middle of the episode, gathered a following large enough to function as a genuine social movement. People are wearing togas made of bed sheets to reduce laundry costs. People are gathering in the streets to identify and castigate the materialistic heathens whose behavior has triggered the economy's wrath. The economy has become, in South Park's public discourse, a deity that the community has offended and must work to restore its relationship with. Kyle's alternative diagnosis is quieter than Randy's, and, in the episode's framing, more accurate. Kyle does not believe the economy is angry. Kyle does not believe the crisis is a moral punishment for collective sin. Kyle believes the crisis is the result of a collapse in trust, and that trust is the actual substance the system runs on. Money is not a physical thing with independent value. Money is an agreement. Credit is an agreement. Investment is an agreement. The entire financial system is a network of agreements held together by the shared belief that the agreements will be honored. When the agreements begin to fail, the belief begins to fail. When the belief begins to fail, the agreements fail faster. The collapse is not the collapse of money. The collapse is the collapse of the belief that money means what the participants have been treating it as meaning. Restore the belief, in Kyle's analysis, and the system can function again. The instrument through which Kyle decides to restore the belief is a Platinum American Express card. The card, in the visual grammar of the episode, is the show's most direct reference to the kind of credit instrument that, in the real world of 2009, represented the apex of available consumer credit. The card has no stated limit. Kyle uses it to pay off the debts of every resident of South Park, one by one, standing at a table on the main street while the indebted townspeople line up to have their obligations settled. The process is depicted as deliberate and thorough. Kyle is not making a grand gesture. He is doing administrative work. He is sitting at the table and processing the line and absorbing each debt into the card's running total as if he is performing a function rather than a sacrifice. The episode structures this sequence as a deliberate and detailed parallel to the passion narrative in Christian theology. Kyle and his friends gather for a dinner that is visually staged as the Last Supper, with the boys arranged in the positions of the 12 apostles, as depicted in Leonardo da Vinci's famous painting. Cartman, whose jealousy of Kyle's growing influence has been the episode's secondary comic thread, occupies the position of Judas at the far end of the table. The positioning is exact. Parker and Stone, who have always been precise about their visual references, are not using the passion parallel loosely. They are using it as a structural argument. The argument is that what Kyle is doing has the same relationship to the community's financial crisis that Christ's sacrifice was understood to have to the community's spiritual crisis. He is absorbing a collective liability into himself so that the community can be released from it. The episode aired on the Wednesday before Easter in 2009. The timing was not accidental. Parker and Stone have stated in interviews about the production that the religious structure of the episode was deliberate, and that the Easter timing was chosen specifically to make the parallel visible. They wanted the audience to encounter the financial rescue narrative and the Christian sacrifice narrative at the same moment, and to register the structural resemblance. The economy in the episode's argument is a faith system. A faith system, when it fails, requires the same kind of response that the Christian tradition describes for spiritual failure. It requires a sacrifice that absorbs the collective liability on behalf of the community. Kyle is the sacrifice. He takes on the debt. The community is freed. The economy recovers. What happens at the end of the episode, however, is the move that turns the satire into something harder. The economy recovers. The shops reopen. The streets fill again. Randy buys a new blender with the same enthusiasm he had for the original. The news broadcasts a summary of the recovery and attributes it to the brave sacrifices of President Barack Obama, whose name is mentioned explicitly and who is credited on national television with having personally carried the burden that allowed the economy to heal. Kyle, lying in his hospital bed after having spent his own credit to pay off the town's collective debt, watches the news broadcast and absorbs the fact that someone else has been given credit for what he did. The joke is clean and direct and operates on two levels simultaneously. The first level is political. Obama was inaugurated in January of 2009, 2 months before the episode aired, and had immediately inherited an economic crisis that had been years in the making. The public discourse of the early Obama era included a significant strand of credit giving that attributed the economic stabilization measures to presidential leadership in a way that compressed and simplified the actual mechanics of who was doing what to stabilize what. The episode is, at this level, a commentary on how political credit for economic outcomes tends to flow toward the most visible figure rather than the actual mechanism of recovery. The second level is deeper and more uncomfortable. The people who actually absorbed the cost of the 2008 financial crisis were, in most cases, not the people who received the credit for the recovery. The families who lost homes to foreclosure did not receive the credit. The workers who lost jobs in the recession did not receive the credit. The pension fund holders whose retirement savings shrank during the market collapse did not receive the credit. The people who received the credit were the people who were already in positions of institutional visibility, which is to say, the people who ran the government programs that stabilized the financial system and the financial institutions that survived the crisis and eventually returned to profitability. Kyle pays the debt. Kyle lies in the hospital. The news says Obama Obama fixed it. Randy buys the new blender. The cycle restarts. What Kyle's arc in the episode is arguing, across its 3 acts, is that debt forgiveness of the scale the 2008 crisis required was never going to be delivered through a market mechanism or a regulatory reform. It required someone to simply absorb the liability. The American government, in the actual history of the crisis, did perform a version of this function through the bailout programs, but the absorption was structured as a loan rather than a gift, and the institutions that received the assistance were required to repay it. The population that bore the indirect costs of the crisis through unemployment and foreclosure and shrunken retirement accounts was not offered a comparable arrangement. Kyle's Platinum card operates differently. Kyle's card pays off the debt completely and unconditionally. The town owes nothing. The town did not negotiate the terms. The town did not know Kyle was doing it. The town, when the economy recovers, does not know that Kyle was the mechanism of the recovery. Kyle never explains this. He does not call a press conference. He does not request acknowledgement. He lies in the hospital and watches the news give the credit elsewhere and says nothing. The episode ends with him in that position. It is not a triumphant ending. It is a specific and accurate portrait of how collective financial rescues tend to distribute recognition. The cost is paid by whoever absorbs it. The credit goes to whoever was already standing closest to the microphone when the recovery began to be visible. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Kyle absorbed the town's debt and received none of the credit, and the episode let that outcome stand without comment. The next section moves outward from the individual sacrifice to the collective engine that created the crisis in the first place, and to the episode that located the real heart of consumer capitalism inside a mirror. Section 6. The Walmart Heart. Consumer debt, shopping addiction, and who is really responsible. There is a quality to the way Americans talked about the arrival of large retail chains in small towns across the 1990s and the early 2000s that is worth sitting with for a moment before moving to the episode itself. The quality is the particular combination of collective grief and individual behavior that defined the conversation. The grief was genuine. The towns that lost their independent hardware stores and their locally owned pharmacies and their Main Street clothing shops to the consolidating pressure of large national retailers experienced real losses. The social fabric of a downtown commercial district is not simply an aesthetic preference. It is a network of relationships, of employment, of local capital circulation, of the daily transactions through which people who live near one another become known to one another. When that network dissolves, the dissolution is felt in ways that are difficult to quantify but easy to recognize. The town changes. The change is, in most accounts, a loss. The quality that makes the conversation strange, however, is what sat alongside this genuine grief. The same people who described the loss in the language of community and heritage and the way things used to be were at the same time driving to the large retailer and filling their carts with merchandise they would not have been able to afford at the prices the local stores charged. The two things were happening simultaneously and being described in separate registers, as if they were independent phenomena rather than two aspects of the same choice. The grief lived in the register of community and values. The shopping lived in the register of practical necessity and household finance. The connection between the two, the fact that the practical necessity and household finance decisions were the direct mechanism of the community loss, was rarely stated plainly in the public conversation. South Park stated it plainly in November of 2004. The episode aired on the 3rd of November in 2004. It was the 9th episode of the 8th season. It was the 120th episode of the series overall. It was written and directed by Trey Parker. It was titled Something Walmart This Way Comes. The title borrowed from Ray Bradbury's 1962 novel, Something Wicked This Way Comes, in which a sinister traveling carnival arrives in a Midwestern town and begins corrupting its inhabitants through the temptation of their own hidden desires. The borrowing was precise. The Walmart in the episode functions exactly as Bradbury's carnival functioned. It does not impose itself on the town, it reveals the town to itself. The opening of the episode establishes the terms quickly. Cartman shares with the boys a claim he has heard about what happens to people when they die. The claim involves involuntary bodily functions at the moment of death. Kyle dismisses the claim as ridiculous. Cartman proposes a bet. The bet is $5, later raised to $15 as additional deaths occur in the background of the main plot. This small comedic thread runs through the entire episode and provides both its structural rhythm and its final punchline, but it is not what the episode is about. The episode is about what happens to the town of South Park when a Walmart opens on a field at the edge of the commercial district. The opening is enormous. The prices performances are extraordinary. The crowd that gathers at Metzger's Field to watch the ribbon cut is the entire town of South Park, drawn by the gravity of a retail event that none of them can fully explain, but all of them can feel as a kind of obligation. They go inside, they buy things. Cartman, in the movie section, finds the film Time Cop available in a 3-pack for $18. Kyle points out that Cartman does not want even one copy of Time Cop. Cartman explains with genuine conviction that purchasing 3 copies at $18 represents a saving of nearly $20 over buying a single copy at the standard retail price. Kyle asks what Cartman is saving $20 toward. Cartman has not considered this. The deal has consumed the question. The purchase is no longer about whether he wants the product. The purchase is about whether the price represents an opportunity that will not recur. Cartman takes 3 copies of Time Cop to the register. This exchange is the smallest and most precise rendering of the episode's central argument. The Walmart does not sell products. The Walmart sells the experience of getting a deal. The deal is the actual commodity. The product is incidental to the deal. The customer who buys 3 copies of a film he does not want is not being irrational in any simple sense. He is responding, entirely rationally, to the incentive structure the store has created. The store has made the deal feel like an achievement. The customer who captures the deal feels, in the moment of purchase, that he has won something. The win is the product. The DVDs are the proof of the win. Whether he ever watches them is irrelevant to the transaction that has just occurred, which was not a transaction about films at all. The town's relationship to the store escalates across the episode. People cannot stop going. Randy faints from over-shopping. The downtown empties. Jim's Drugs closes. The hardware store closes. The clothing store closes. The commercial ecology of South Park's Main Street collapses, link by link, as the money that previously circulated through that ecology redirects itself to the parking lot at the edge of town. Stan and Kyle, watching the downtown die, attempt a boycott. The boycott fails. The town agrees to it and then drives to the Walmart anyway. The Walmart burns down. The town burns it down. The crowd watches it burn and swears to each other that this will be different now. The next morning, the store has been rebuilt. The crowds return. Stan and Kyle travel to the corporate headquarters in Bentonville, Arkansas, which is the real-world location of the actual Walmart corporate office, a detail Parker and Stone included deliberately to ground the satire in the actual geography of the company they were depicting. The journey is paced as a parody of the quest structure of adventure films, with each stage of the approach to headquarters increasing in difficulty and portent. They are told by an old employee that the only way to destroy the Walmart permanently is to find and destroy its heart. They make it to the final chamber. The employee points to the heart. The heart is a mirror. The mirror is the episode's thesis rendered as a physical object. The old employee explains what they are seeing. The heart of the Walmart is the consumer. The store has no independent existence from the people who shop in it. The store grew because the consumers came. The store expanded because the consumers kept coming. The consumers built the store one transaction at a time, over years, through the daily accumulated expression of their own preferences and their own responses to the incentive structures the store designed for them. The store is not a predator that descended on South Park from outside. The store is South Park's own consumer appetite made visible in the form of a building. To destroy the store, you have to change something inside the customer. The customer is the engine. The store is the output of the engine. The mirror is saying that the answer is not in the building. Randy, at a town meeting, delivers the speech that makes this argument in its plainest form. The Walmart, Randy says, was them. His voice in this moment is not the voice of the buffoon he usually plays. Parker writes the line with something close to earnestness. The town has not been victimized. The town has been revealed. The store is the material consequence of what the town actually wanted more than it wanted to preserve what the town said it valued. The grief about the downtown was real. The drive to the Walmart was also real. Both things expressed the same population. The population that mourned the local stores and the population that emptied them were not two different groups. They were the same group expressing itself in two different registers at the same time. The episode then delivers its final structural argument in the form of a time lapse. The Walmart has been destroyed. The town has agreed to shop locally. Jimbo suggests Jim's Drugs as the alternative. The crowd walks to Jim's Drugs together, full of resolution and community feeling. The time lapse begins. Jim's Drugs expands. The aisles grow. The parking parking lot grows, the lights multiply. The building grows to the size of the store that was just destroyed. The crowd at the end of the time-lapse is burning Jim's drugs to the ground, while Randy promises they will not make that mistake again, and Mr. Garrison suggests the true value down the street instead. The crowd agrees and walks off together. The time-lapse is one of the more structurally complete arguments the show would make across its entire run about the nature of consumer capitalism. The argument is that the large retailer and the local store are not morally distinct categories. They are sequential stages in the same process. The process is driven by consumer preference and consumer behavior. The institution that expresses consumer preference most efficiently at any given moment will grow. As it grows, it will begin to resemble the institution the community previously outgrew. The cycle does not have an exit. The cycle has stages. The community is always in one of the stages. The moral outrage at any given stage does not address the engine that produces the next stage. The engine is the mirror. The mirror is in the community. The community will not destroy it. What the episode was doing in 2004 was making an argument about debt and consumer behavior that the financial press was not yet framing in quite the same terms. The subprime mortgage crisis was still years away. The debt-driven consumption that would eventually contribute to the collapse of 2008 was still being treated in most mainstream economic coverage as a sign of American consumer confidence rather than as a structural vulnerability. South Park saw the engine before the engine failed. The Walmart episode was not predicting the 2008 crisis. It was describing the consumer behavior that made the crisis possible. The people who filled their carts in the Walmart were the same people who were refinancing their homes to fund consumption they could not afford on income alone. The store was not the cause of the debt. The mirror was the cause of the debt. The mirror was already there in 2004, rotating quietly at the center of the building. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The Walmart mirror showed that the consumer is the engine and the corporation is the output. The next section moves to the episode that asked what happens when the engine is deliberately targeted by a system designed to extract maximum value from its most vulnerable participants. Section 7. Cartman's Formula: How Predatory Finance Turns Ordinary People into Product. There is a category of financial product that does not present itself as a financial product. The category includes things that look on the surface like entertainment, things that look like hobbies, things that look like gifts, things that look like the expression of affection between people who love each other. The category is wide and it has been growing across the last several decades as the boundary between consumer entertainment and consumer finance has become increasingly difficult to locate with any precision. The lottery ticket is a financial product sold as a small excitement. The scratch card is a financial product sold as a moment of suspense. The casino floor is a financial product sold as an evening out. The home shopping network is a financial product sold as company during a quiet afternoon. What all of these products share beneath their different surface presentations is a design principle. The design principle is that the customer should not be thinking about the financial transaction while the financial transaction is occurring. The customer should be thinking about the excitement, the suspense, the evening out, the company. The financial transaction is the infrastructure underneath the experience. The experience is what is being sold. The money is what is being collected. South Park had been circling this category of financial product across several episodes before Cash for Gold gave it the most direct treatment. The circling produced, across different seasons and different targets, a consistent set of observations about the mechanism. The mechanism is always the same in its essential structure, regardless of the specific product or population being targeted. An emotional need is identified. A product is designed to appear to meet that need. The product is priced at a level that extracts maximum revenue from the population experiencing the need. The population experiencing the need is selected, wherever possible, for characteristics that make the extraction more reliable. The characteristics include isolation, cognitive vulnerability, limited access to external advice, and a strong desire for the feeling the product appears to offer. The design process is not accidental. It is not the incidental outcome of a business trying to serve its customers honestly. It is the deliberate optimization of an extraction mechanism. Cartman, in Cash for Gold, understands this mechanism immediately and completely. His understanding is presented as comedy, but it is genuine understanding. When he explains the formula on the whiteboard, he is not performing comprehension he does not have. He has looked at the home shopping network operation and seen, with the specific clarity that the show gives him when he is at his most operationally focused, exactly what the operation is doing and why it works. The formula is simple. Cash for Gold stores provide a resale market for unwanted merchandise. Home shopping networks provide a sales channel for cheap merchandise merchandise marked up to extraordinary prices. Elderly people with disposable income and reduced critical faculties provide a customer base whose purchasing decisions are driven more by emotional response than by rational evaluation of value. Combine the three elements in the correct sequence, and money flows from the elderly customer's credit card through the shopping network's revenue to the manufacturer in India and back around again. The formula is not illegal. The formula is not secret. The formula is, in Cartman's assessment, simply a piece of market architecture that the participants in the cycle have constructed and operate. What makes Cartman's relationship to the formula different from Stan's relationship to it is not that Cartman is smarter or more analytical. It is that Cartman does not have the emotional obstacle that prevents Stan from seeing the mechanism clearly at first. Stan's entry into the cash for gold world is through his grandfather. Marvin's gift of the bolo tie, and the love that the gift represents, is the thing that makes the economic structure of the transaction temporarily invisible to Stan. He sees the tie as an expression of his grandfather's feeling for him, before he sees it as the output of a predatory sales operation. The love and the predation are, in the design of the episode, not separable. The predation works because the love is real. The channel targets people like Marvin not despite the fact that they want to give something to the people they care about, but precisely because of it. The desire to give is the vulnerability the channel is exploiting. Marvin is not a foolish old man who was tricked into buying something worthless. Marvin is a man who loves his grandson and was sold a product specifically designed to intercept that love and convert it into revenue. This is the observation that elevates the episode above a simple satire of home shopping networks. The target of the episode is not Dean, even though Dean is the human face the operation presents to its viewers. Dean is replaceable. If Dean dies, and in the episode he does, the rotating jewelry carousel will still be spinning when the next broadcast begins, and a new host will be selling the same merchandise to the same viewers using the same techniques. The target of the episode is the design of the system itself, which has located a genuine human need, which is the need of elderly people in reduced social circumstances to feel connected and to express care for the people they love, and has built a commercial architecture around that need that extracts money from it with the efficiency of a machine that has been running a long time and knows exactly what it is doing. The journey Stan makes through the supply chain, from the cash for gold store to the smelting facility to the shipping operation to the factory in India, is a journey through the anatomy of the machine. At each node he arrives at, the workers present can accurately describe their own function as a legitimate commercial operation. The smelter smelts, the shipper ships, the manufacturer manufactures. Nobody at any of these nodes has a direct relationship with Marvin. Nobody at any of these nodes knows that Marvin cannot always remember what year it is, or that he sometimes calls his grandson by the wrong name. Nobody at any of these nodes has the information that would make the moral weight of their participation in the system visible to them. The information has been distributed across the chain in a way that ensures no single participant holds enough of it to feel responsible for the outcome. The design is, in this respect, ingenious. The predation is diffused. The extraction is systemic. Nobody is guilty because the guilt is structural. Cartman, arriving at the factory in India with the intention of cutting out the middleman and purchasing directly from the manufacturer, discovers Stan and the boys already there. His plan to expand his own shopping network by sourcing cheaper merchandise at the production point collapses when the boys trigger the montage sequence that makes the entire loop visible. Cartman's response to seeing the complete picture of the cycle is interesting. He is not troubled by the ethics of the operation. He is not moved by the revelation that the loop depends on the exploitation of people like Marvin. What troubles Cartman is that he has been working within a system whose full structure he did not previously understand, and the full structure reveals that he was himself, in his role as a cash for gold buyer reselling to elderly customers, being played by the same mechanism he thought he was operating. The Vietnamese jewelry store owner he visited to restock his inventory was using the same sales techniques on him that he was using on his elderly viewers. The cycle consumed everyone who entered it. The real-world context in which the episode aired in March of 2012 was one in which the specific industry it was depicting had become, in the years following the 2008 financial crisis, significantly larger and more visible than it had been in previous decades. The economic stress of the post-crisis period had driven many families to sell household valuables, which had expanded the supply side of the cash for gold market substantially. At the same time, the elderly population of the United States was growing as the baby boomer generation aged, and the home shopping industry had been expanding its reach and refining its targeting of this demographic for years. The Federal Trade Commission had published several consumer alerts in the years before the episode aired, warning specifically about the exploitation of elderly consumers through television shopping channels and telephone sales operations. The episode did not engage with the regulatory response directly. The episode engaged with the mechanism the regulation was trying to address, and found that the mechanism was too structurally distributed to be addressed by targeting any individual actor within it. What Cash for Gold ultimately argued, in its assembled form, was that the financial predation of vulnerable populations is not primarily a problem of individual bad actors who can be identified and removed. It is a problem of system design. The design is functional. The design is profitable. The design persists because it is profitable, and because no single participant in the design bears enough of the moral weight to feel compelled to stop. Dean is the visible villain of the episode, and Dean dies, but the carousel keeps spinning. The carousel is the point. The carousel is the argument. The carousel is what remains when the villain has been removed and the supply chain has been documented and the boys have flown home from India. The carousel spins because the cycle that feeds it has not been interrupted. The cycle has not been interrupted because interrupting it would require changing something about the emotional needs of isolated elderly people, which is not something that any regulatory framework or satirical cartoon can accomplish on its own. Stan's final move in the episode is not an attempt to interrupt the cycle. Stan gives up on interrupting the cycle. He takes the picture frame the Indian factory worker gave him, puts a photograph of Marvin's dog Patches in it, and gives it to his grandfather. Marvin looks at the photograph. He has not been able to remember the dog's face for some time. He is genuinely moved. The gesture is small and it costs nothing, and it addresses in the most direct way available to a 10-year-old boy the actual emotional need that the home shopping channel had been monetizing. Marvin needed to remember something he loved. Stan gave him the memory. The channel had been selling him the feeling of giving. Stan gave him the feeling of receiving. The economy of the gesture is the opposite of the economy of the channel. Nothing was extracted, something was given. The carousel kept spinning in the background, but for a moment it was not the most important thing in the frame. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Cash for Gold found the emotional core underneath the predatory loop and left it intact while the system around it kept running. The next section moves to a different kind of financial manipulation, one that targeted not the elderly but the entire population, and that used the language of cultural progress to extract money from people who believed they were spending it on something that mattered. Writing now. Section 8, PC Principle Soto Sopa and the Price of Performing Virtue. There is a way of spending money that does not feel like spending money in the conventional sense. The conventional sense is transactional. A price is presented, a product is evaluated against the price, a decision is made, the money changes hands, the product is taken home, the transaction is complete. This is the model of consumer behavior that most economic analysis defaults to, and it is accurate enough for most of the ordinary purchases that most people make on most days. But there is a category of spending that operates differently, and the category has been growing in visibility and commercial importance across the last 20 years in a way that the standard transactional model does not adequately describe. The category is the purchase that functions as a statement about who the buyer is. The category is the purchase that is not primarily about the product being acquired, but about the identity being performed through the acquisition. The identity purchase has existed in consumer economies for as long as consumer economies have existed. Luxury goods have always been, in part, identity purchases. The expensive car and the designer handbag have always communicated something about the buyer that is separate from their functional utility. But something changed across the decade between roughly 2010 and 2020 in the specific content of the identity being performed through consumption. The identity that became available for purchase was not primarily a status identity in the old sense of wealth or social position. The identity was a moral one. Buying the right product became a way of being the right kind of person. Buying from the right company became a way of having the right values. The price premium attached to the moral product was not experienced by the buyer as a financial cost. It was experienced as an investment in their own sense of themselves as someone who cares about the right things. South Park engaged with this development on the 30th of September in 2015. The episode was the third of the 19th season. It was the 260th episode of the series overall. It was written and directed by Trey Parker. It was titled The City Part of Town. The episode built its argument around the arrival of a specific retailer, a Whole Foods market, in the fictional Colorado town. Whole Foods was, by 2015, the most recognizable symbol in the American retail landscape of the moral premium product. The company had built a business model and a brand identity around the proposition that shopping for groceries could be an expression of values rather than simply a practical necessity. The stores were designed to feel like a certain kind of place. The product selection communicated a certain kind of politics. The price points signaled a certain kind of consumer. Walking into a Whole Foods and walking out with a bag of groceries was, in the cultural vocabulary of 2015, a statement about who you were, not just what you ate. The episode arrives at this target through a political problem. South Park has been embarrassed in the national media. The previous episode of the season had depicted the town's response to Canadian immigration in a way that made South Park look, to outside observers, like a community of provincial bigots with no exposure to broader cultural values. Jimmy Fallon has been making jokes about South Park on The Tonight Show. The town has watched the segment and absorbed the humiliation of being the punchline. At the next town meeting, Randy Marsh proposes the solution. The solution is a Whole Foods. Not because the town needs the groceries the store would sell, because having the store would communicate to Jimmy Fallon and to the rest of the country that South Park is the kind of place where people care about the things that the kind of people who shop at Whole Foods care about. The store is a credential. The store is, in Randy's formulation, the fastest available mechanism for converting the town's public image from backwards to progressive. Mayor McDaniels calls the corporation. The corporation explains, with the careful diction of an institution that understands its own market position very well, that Whole Foods does not open stores everywhere. The corporation has standards. The corporation sends a representative to assess prospective communities before making placement decisions. The assessment will be based on whether the community reflects the values the brand represents. Randy receives this information and immediately begins designing a neighborhood that will pass the assessment. The neighborhood will not be built because the residents of South Park have decided they want to live somewhere that reflects those values. The neighborhood will be built because those values need to be performed convincingly enough to fool a corporate inspector for the duration of his visit. The neighborhood Randy designs will be constructed around the existing house of Kenny McCormick and his family. The choice of the McCormick house as the anchor of the new district is the episode's most pointed single decision, and it is made with complete deliberateness. The McCormick family is, across the run of South Park, the show's consistent marker of genuine economic hardship. Stuart McCormick, Kenny's father, is unemployed or underemployed in most of the episodes where he appears. The family lives in a small house in poor condition. The children lack the things their classmates take for granted. Kenny dies repeatedly, in part because the deaths cost nothing in the canon of the show, and the character's disposability is connected to his family's economic disposability. The McCormick house is the least desirable residential property in South Park. Randy wants to build the new progressive neighborhood around it precisely because the visible presence of a working-class home in a gentrifying district provides the aesthetic texture that wealthy progressive consumers find appealing. The poverty is not an obstacle to the neighborhood's appeal. The poverty is an amenity. The name Randy chooses for the new district is Sodo Sopa. The name is an acronym for South of Downtown South Park. The acronym format is a direct parody of the naming conventions that real estate developers had been applying to gentrifying urban neighborhoods for years. Soho, Tribeca, Nomad, Nolita. The formula takes a directional description of where the neighborhood is relative to something else and compresses it into a word that sounds like it has an identity of its own, rather than being a borrowed description. The name implies that the neighborhood existed before the developers named it, that they discovered something already there rather than constructing something from scratch. The episode is precise about this. Sodo Sopa did not exist before Randy created it. The poverty and the rundown houses were there. The identity was invented and applied from above, by someone who needed the neighborhood to appear to be what he was telling the corporate inspector it was. The commercials Randy produces for the district are among the episode's most precise pieces of satire. They are filmed in live action rather than animation, which is a deliberate formal choice. The use of real footage rather than cartoon imagery gives the commercials the exact visual texture of actual real estate marketing material from the period. Attractive young people walk through cobblestone streets at the specific quality of evening light that real estate photography has been using for decades to suggest that a neighborhood is warm and welcoming and full of people who have made the right choices. The commercials end with the phrase, "Welcome home." This phrase appears in actual developer marketing across the country for the same reason it appears in the South Park parody. The phrase is designed to produce in the viewer not a response to a property, but a response to an identity. You are not being offered a location. You are being offered a version of yourself. PC Principal hosts the Whole Foods assessment visit at the elementary school. The classroom has been rearranged before the inspector arrives. Token Black has been moved to the front row. Jimmy Jimmy Vollmer has been placed next to him. The two of them are in the visual center of the room, positioned to be seen by the inspector as evidence that the school and the community are diverse and inclusive. The children have not been told why the seating has changed. The children did not consent to being used as props. Their presence is not evidence of the town's actual commitment to inclusion. Their presence is the performance of inclusion for the benefit of a corporate inspector whose job is to determine whether the community is the kind of place the brand wants to be associated with. Token is not a member of an inclusive community in this scene. Token is a marketing asset. The Whole Foods inspector, watching the brawl that breaks out when the adults discover child labor in the competing neighborhood across the street, delivers his verdict with the calm of someone who has seen many prospective communities and knows exactly what he is looking for. He tells the assembled townspeople that he has never seen a community trying so hard to perform social consciousness, and that this is precisely the kind of community Whole Foods is looking for. The performance was the test. Passing the test required demonstrating that the town was willing to go to considerable effort and expense to appear to be the right kind of place. A town that was actually the right kind of place would not have needed to perform. The performance is, paradoxically, the evidence of fitness. The brand is looking for communities that understand the market well enough to perform its values convincingly, because those are the communities whose residents will pay the premium to continue performing them. The final structural move of the episode is where the argument lands hardest. The Whole Foods is not built in Sodo Sopa. The store is built in the competing neighborhood CTPA Town, the place whose name translates in the phonetics of the episode's dialogue as the shitty part of town. The development and the prestige that comes with the store moves away from the district that was built to attract it. Sodo Sopa is abandoned, its restaurants close, its cobblestone streets empty. The McCormick house is left surrounded by the ruins of the neighborhood that was built around it, without anyone asking the McCormicks what they wanted. Kenny returns home from his shift, having earned a small amount of money which he spends entirely on a doll for his sister. He gives her the doll. He tries to sleep in a house now flanked by empty storefronts lit by neon signs advertising businesses that no longer operate. He has been used as a prop in a transaction that produced nothing for his family and that he had no part in designing. The episode is, in its complete form, a precise description of what the moral premium market does to the populations it uses as raw material. The premium market requires evidence of authenticity. Authentic poverty is a form of aesthetic capital in the gentrification economy. The McCormick house provided that capital. The capital was extracted. The McCormicks received nothing. The store opened somewhere else. The performance moved on to the next location. The carousel kept spinning. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Sodo Sopa showed that the moral premium market uses real poverty as aesthetic capital and pays nothing for it. The next section turns to the financial system's most recent mutation, the one that abandoned physical goods entirely and began selling belief in the currency itself as the product. Section 9. Butters as Victor Chaos, NFTs, crypto, and when the currency becomes the scam. There is a particular quality to financial manias that historians of economics have documented across several centuries of market behavior, and the quality is consistent enough across different eras and different instruments that it functions almost as a diagnostic signature. The quality is the inversion of the normal relationship between the asset and its value. In a normal market, an asset has value because it does something, or produces something, or provides access to something that the buyer wants. The price of the asset is, in the normal case, connected in some legible way to the thing the asset is or does. The connection can be complicated, and the price can be wrong in either direction, and the valuation methods used to assess the connection can be disputed. But the connection exists. There is a referent. The price is a price for something. In a financial mania, the connection breaks. The asset stops being valued primarily for what it is or does and starts being valued primarily for the fact that its price is rising. The rising price is the asset. The asset is the rising price. The investor is not acquiring the thing because the thing has utility. The investor is acquiring the thing because other investors are acquiring the thing, and the price is therefore going up. And the price going up means that selling the thing to the next investor will produce a profit. The profit is the product. The thing is the medium through which the profit travels. The thing itself does not matter. The thing could be tulip bulbs. The thing could be railroad shares. The thing could be mortgage-backed securities. The thing could be a digital certificate of ownership attached to a computer-generated image of a cartoon monkey wearing sunglasses. The specific nature of the thing is almost irrelevant to the structure of the mania. What matters is that enough people believe in the price, and that the belief sustains the price long enough for the investors who arrived early to sell their positions to the investors who arrived later, before the belief collapses and the price returns to something closer to what the thing was always actually worth. South Park engaged with the specific mania of the early 21st century, the crypto and NFT explosion of the pandemic era, across several episodes and specials produced between 2021 and 2022. The engagement was not a single focused treatment in the way that Margaritaville had been a single focused treatment of the 2008 banking crisis. The engagement was distributed across a future set storyline that used the long-form format of the post-COVID specials to depict, in the form of an imagined future, what the culture of pandemic-era financial speculation looked like from the outside. The post-COVID special aired on Paramount Plus on the 25th of November in 2021. Its sequel, The Return of COVID, aired on the 16th of December of the same year. Both were written and directed by Trey Parker. Both were set approximately 40 years in the future in a version of South Park populated by the adult versions of the show's main characters. The future world the specials depict borrows its visual texture from a specific tradition of science fiction cinema. The streets are wet, the lighting is neon. The architecture is the architecture of a city that has been continuously inhabited and continuously modified without ever being coherently planned, resulting in a built environment that is dense and layered and slightly threatening even in its ordinary moments. The visual reference is Ridley Scott's 1982 film Blade Runner, which depicted Los Angeles in 2019 as a place of extreme inequality and constant atmospheric drizzle and enormous corporate advertising projected onto the sides of buildings. The choice of this specific visual reference is not casual. Blade Runner is a film about a society that has allowed its corporate and financial systems to grow without adequate governance until the systems have shaped the physical environment of human life in ways that most of the people living in that environment experience as simply the weather. South Park's future looks like Blade Runner because Blade Runner looks like what happens when the financial systems the current show is satirizing are allowed to run to their logical conclusions. Butter Stotch in the future timeline has become a man who calls himself Victor Chaos. He is institutionalized. The institution is a psychiatric facility. The facility is where Stan and Kyle go when they need to speak with him as part of their attempt to understand what happened to Kenny. Victor Chaos sits in his room in the facility, and he is, by every behavioral indicator the episode provides, a man who has been consumed by a single idea that the world around him has stopped confirming. The idea is NFTs. The idea is the belief that non-fungible tokens, certificates of digital ownership attached to images that exist on a blockchain, are a genuine store of value and a legitimate asset class and a transformative financial instrument that the rest of the world is failing to understand because the rest of the world is not paying sufficient attention. When Stan and Kyle arrive, Victor Chaos greets them by attempting to sell them NFTs. He does not greet them first. He does not ask how they are or acknowledge that they have come to see him in a psychiatric facility. He attempts to sell them NFTs. The pitch he delivers is the pitch of someone who has been making the same pitch for so long that the social context in which the pitch is being delivered has become irrelevant to him. He explains that if everyone believes in NFTs, everyone who holds them will make money. The value is held up by the collective belief. The collective belief is sustained by the continued participation of the participants. The system works as long as people stay in the system. The problem, in Victor Chaos's account, is that people keep leaving the system. People keep selling. People keep expressing doubt. If people would simply stay in the system and keep believing, the value would be secure. This is, in its structural bones, the same argument that every participant in every financial mania has made, in different vocabularies and with different specific instruments across the entire history of speculative markets. The tulip bulb investor of 17th century Holland was making the same argument. The railroad share investor of 19th century England was making the same argument. The dot-com investor of late 20th century America was making the same argument. The argument is always that the value is real and the doubters are wrong and the people selling are making a mistake, and if everyone would simply stay and believe the price would be sustained. The argument is always, in its essential structure, a request that the people who have not yet sold their positions refrain from doing so that the people who are currently holding can sell at the price that the collective belief is currently sustaining. Victor Chaos is not stupid. This is important to the episode's argument. argument. Butters was never the stupid character in South Park. Butters was always the innocent one, the one whose relationship to the world was defined by a kind of open-faced trust in the systems and people around him. The Butters who became Victor Chaos was a Butters who took that trust and applied it to an asset class designed to exploit exactly that quality. He believed in NFTs with the same completeness that the younger Butters believed in the adults around him, and with the same blindness to the structure of the thing he was trusting. The belief produced the same outcome it always produced when Butters trusted the wrong system. It consumed him. It cost him everything. And it left him in a room in a psychiatric facility, still trying to sell. The Return of COVID special delivers a second sequence about the financial culture of the pandemic era that operates as a companion piece to the Victor Chaos portrait. A firefighter arrives at the site of a disaster. He delivers a monologue about what he has lost. His savings are gone. His house is gone. His retirement is gone. He describes these losses in the specific vocabulary of someone who took financial advice from the online communities that formed around cryptocurrency investment in the early years of the pandemic. Communities that developed their own language and their own internal mythology about what the investments meant and who the investors were, and what was going to happen to the people who stayed in versus the people who sold. The firefighter, at the end of his monologue, reveals that what he has remaining is a digital image of a small green panda on a skateboard. It is an NFT. It is the thing he chose instead of the savings and the house and the retirement. He is pulled away from the disaster scene by a colleague who wants to show him a small turtle with wings that might be a good investment. The season 25 premiere, titled Pajama Day, which aired on the 2nd of February in 2022, extended the satire to a specific real-world moment that had crystallized the cultural absurdity of the crypto promotion era in a single piece of actual television. Matt Damon had appeared in a widely circulated commercial for the cryptocurrency exchange Crypto.com in late 2021. The commercial depicted Damon in a series of historically resonant settings, alongside figures of great courage and achievement, delivering the tagline, "Fortune favors the brave." The commercial was, in its visual grammar and its emotional register, an attempt to attach the accumulated cultural weight of human courage and historical achievement to the act of opening a cryptocurrency trading account. Cartman, in the classroom scene that responds to this commercial, asks his classmates what Matt Damon says in the Bitcoin commercial. Clyde answers correctly. Another student mentions that his father followed the advice in the commercial and lost all of his money. Cartman responds that yes, everyone did, but that they were brave in losing it. The exchange is the entire era compressed into 3 lines. The commercial had positioned financial speculation as an act of courage and historical significance. The result of the courage was the loss of money. The framing survived the loss. The investors who followed the advice and lost had been told that the loss was brave. The bravery framing was, in the episode's reading, the mechanism that kept people in positions they should have exited. Nobody wants to be the person who lacked the courage the commercial told them they needed. The courage framing was doing financial work. The framing was keeping money in the system by associating exit with cowardice. The financial instrument and the emotional leverage being applied to hold people inside it were not separate phenomena. They were the same product. What the crypto and NFT episodes were collectively arguing was that the financial crisis of the pandemic era was structurally different from the financial crises the show had depicted before, and different in a specific and important way. The 2008 crisis had been a crisis of instruments that were too complex for the people buying them to understand, but the instruments had at least been attached to physical assets. The mortgages were attached to houses. The houses were real. They could be visited and assessed and valued, even if the valuation turned out to be wrong. The NFT and crypto manias of 2020 to 2022 were different in that the instruments were not attached to physical assets at all. They were attached to belief. The belief was the asset. The price was sustained by the consensus among the holders that the price should be what it was. When the consensus broke, the price did not decline to a lower level determined by the underlying asset value. The price declined to whatever the underlying asset, which was only the belief, was worth in the absence of the belief. In many cases, that was very close to nothing. Victor Chaos was not a victim of a complex instrument he failed to understand. Victor Chaos was a victim of a system that had been constructed entirely out of the belief he was willing to contribute to it, and that consumed him when the belief ran out. The deepest observation the specials made about the crypto era was embedded not in the Victor Chaos sequences, but in the broader visual choice to depict the future of South Park as Blade Runner. The Blade Runner future is a future in which the financial and corporate systems of the present have been allowed to accumulate without constraint until they have become the physical environment of ordinary life. The wet streets and the neon advertisements and the crowded lower levels and the empty upper levels are the material consequence of financial systems that ran without adequate governance across the intervening decades. The future the specials depict is not a dystopia imposed by a dramatic catastrophe. It is a dystopia produced by the quiet accumulation of the same financial behaviors the show had been depicting since 1998. The gnomes are still collecting underpants somewhere in that future. Phase 2 is still missing. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The crypto specials found the mania's core in a man in a psychiatric ward still trying to sell, and the Blade Runner future they depicted was the accumulated consequence of every financial loop the show had traced across 25 years. The final section turns to the moment when the show itself became the thing it had been satirizing. Section 10, the $1.5 billion deal, Sermon on the Mount, and the show inside the system. There are two dates in the summer of 2025 that, when placed next to each other without any additional framing or editorial comment, tell a story that South Park spent 27 years building the vocabulary to tell. The first date is the 21st of July. On that day, Trey Parker and Matt Stone signed a contract with Paramount Skydance, the parent company of Comedy Central, for the production of 50 new South Park episodes across a 5-year period. The contract was valued at approximately $1.5 billion. The deal was reported across the entertainment press as one of the largest individual creator contracts in the history of American television. Parker and Stone had, in a single transaction, become the beneficiaries of exactly the kind of corporate financial arrangement that the show they were contracting to produce had been dissecting and satirizing for the better part of 3 decades. The second date is the 23rd of July. On that day, 2 days after the signing, South Park aired an episode that accused the company that had just signed the deal of being corrupt. The episode was titled Sermon on the Mount. The title was a deliberate pun. The mount in question was Paramount, the company whose name contains the word. The Sermon on the Mount in the Christian tradition is the speech in which Jesus delivers his most essential moral teachings, including the Beatitudes and the instruction to love one's enemies. The episode used the title to frame what was about to happen as a moral teaching delivered from a position of elevated authority, which was both the sincere self-presentation of Parker and Stone as critics of corporate power, and, in the specific circumstances of its broadcast, a joke at their own expense that only became funnier the more carefully you looked at it. To understand what the episode was doing and why the timing of it mattered, it helps to understand what the months leading up to the signing had actually looked like from the outside. Parker and Stone had been publicly unhappy about the Paramount Skydance merger for a significant period before the contract was finalized. They had posted on the show's official social media account that the merger process was a disruptive mess that was directly interfering with the production of the show. The season 27 premiere had been delayed by 2 weeks as a result of the ongoing negotiations and the legal uncertainty they created. Their legal team had, according to reporting from multiple entertainment industry outlets at the time, threatened litigation against Paramount and Skydance on multiple occasions during the negotiation period. The initial arrangement Parker and Stone proposed was a 10-year deal valued at approximately $3 billion. Skydance declined the proposal. The deal that was eventually signed was shorter, cheaper, and reached only after a period of sustained conflict between the show's creators and the corporate structure that owned the rights to distribute it. This backstory matters for understanding the episode that aired 2 days after the signing, because the episode was not produced in a vacuum of creative freedom. The episode was produced under conditions in which the creators had been negotiating, threatening, and ultimately agreeing with the corporation they were about to accuse of corruption. The accusation and the agreement arrived in the same week. The check was being written at the same time as the indictment. This is not a contradiction that undermines the argument the episode was making. This is, in the show's own long-standing analytical framework, the argument the episode was making made visible in the actual behavior of the show's creators, rather than in the behavior of fictional characters in a Colorado town. The corporate context the episode was responding to had been developing across the months preceding its broadcast. Paramount was in the process of completing a merger with Skydance Media, an entertainment company controlled by David Ellison, whose father, Larry Ellison, was the founder of the technology corporation Oracle. The merger required approval from the Federal Communications Commission. In July of 2025, Paramount reached a settlement agreement in a lawsuit that the current president of the United States, Donald Trump, had filed against CBS News over the editing of an interview with a political figure during the 2024 election campaign. The settlement amount was $16 million. In the days following the settlement, CBS announced the cancellation of a late-night program whose host had been one of the most consistent and prominent critics of Trump in American broadcast television. The FCC, chaired by a Trump appointee named Brendan Carr, approved the Paramount Skydance merger on the 24th of July, one day after the South Park episode aired. The sequence of these events, laid out in order, has a particular shape that the show had been describing for years without knowing the specific names or dates that would eventually fill it in. A corporation requires government approval for a commercial transaction. The government official responsible for granting the approval has a political relationship with a person who has a legal dispute with a subsidiary of the corporation. The corporation settles the legal dispute for a sum of money. The government official grants the approval. A prominent critic of the politically connected person loses their platform in the aftermath. The corporation denies that these events are connected. The chronology suggests otherwise. The episode the show produced 2 days after signing was built around this accusation in a way that was precise enough to function as journalism and absurdist enough to function as the kind of cartoon that an entertainment corporation could broadcast without technically incriminating itself. The cartoon version of the current president was depicted using a technique Parker and Stone had developed at their artificial intelligence production company, Deep Voodoo, which involved applying a deepfake rendering to a cutout photograph of the actual president's face, attached to an animated cartoon body. The technique had been used for a previous depiction of Saddam Hussein in the show's early seasons, and the visual echo of that earlier choice was deliberate. The president was depicted in a series of scenarios that included a sequence with Satan and a discussion about whether his name appeared in documents relating to a convicted sex offender whose client list had been a subject of public speculation for years. The Paramount component of the episode was, in commercial terms, the more substantive and more carefully constructed piece of the broadcast. In the episode's plot, Jesus is compelled by a legal settlement to enter the South Park elementary classroom and deliver religious instruction to the students. The settlement has been reached between a religious organization and a governing authority, and the terms require the school to incorporate the instruction into its curriculum, regardless of whether the school or its students or their parents have consented to this arrangement. Jesus delivers the instruction. He delivers it, however, through clenched teeth and with the visible demeanor of someone who is performing compliance rather than expressing genuine commitment. He tells the assembled townspeople, at a meeting called to address the situation, not to protest. He points to the cancellation of the television program whose host had been critical of the president. He explains that Paramount owns the network that broadcasts that program, that Paramount has paid the president to resolve a legal dispute, and that the townspeople should accept what is being done to their children rather than risk a similar outcome for themselves. This is, when the theatrical framing is removed, a straightforward accusation. Jesus delivers the accusation because Jesus is, in South Park's long-running characterization, the character who is required to say things he would prefer not to say, because the institution he represents has made commitments that constrain his freedom to act according to his actual values. Jesus in South Park has always been somewhat trapped. In Sermon on the Mount, he is specifically and visibly trapped by a corporate settlement, and the episode makes sure the audience understands which corporate settlement it is referring to. What makes the episode particularly interesting as a piece of financial and institutional satire, rather than simply as political commentary, is the mechanism it is describing. The mechanism is not censorship in the conventional sense. Censorship in its conventional form involves the suppression of speech. A government or institution identifies speech it does not want to exist and takes action to prevent the speech from being produced or distributed. The mechanism the episode is describing is different. The mechanism is the settlement. The settlement does not suppress speech directly. The settlement creates a financial incentive structure in which the continued production of certain speech becomes commercially costly for the institution that would otherwise platform it. The speech does not need to be banned. The speech simply becomes something the institution can no longer afford to host. The critic does not need to be silenced. The critic's platform simply needs to become a financial liability rather than a financial asset. This mechanism is, in its structural logic, the same mechanism that Margaritaville identified in the banking system, the mechanism of making the complicated consequence of a financial arrangement visible only after the arrangement has already been executed. The homeowner who signed the mortgage did not understand that they were participating in a system that would eventually collapse. The viewer who watched the late-night program did not understand that they were watching something whose existence was contingent on its host's relationship with people who had the leverage to make it financially untenable. The arrangement that made it untenable was completed months before anyone outside the negotiating rooms knew it had been made. The cancellation arrived, like the bank teller's announcement that the money was gone, as a sudden disclosure of a consequence that had already been determined by an earlier transaction. The show itself, as a property and a commercial entity, has always had a more complicated relationship with the financial systems it depicts looks than its outsider posture might suggest. South Park has been, for most of its run, an extremely profitable commercial property for the corporations that have held the distribution rights to it. Comedy Central, which is owned by Paramount, has generated substantial revenue from the show across more than 2 decades. The advertising revenue from the show's original broadcasts, the licensing fees from international distribution, the streaming revenue from the deals the show has made across multiple platforms, the merchandise revenue from the show's considerable licensed products business, all of these revenue streams have made South Park one of the more financially significant properties in the Paramount portfolio. The show that depicts the consumer as the heart of the Walmart has itself been the product that the corporation has been selling to the consumer for 27 years. The show that showed Randy's integrity dissolving into market compromise across 7 seasons of the Tegrity arc has itself been subject to the same commercial pressures it depicted Randy experiencing. The show that argued in Gnomes that big corporations grow because they give people what they want has itself grown into one of the most financially successful animated properties in the history of American television, precisely because it gives people what they want. None of this invalidates the arguments the show has made. The arguments are real arguments, and most of them are good ones. The Margaritaville banking sequences are genuinely precise about the 2008 crisis. The Walmart mirror is a genuinely accurate description of consumer behavior. The Treasury chicken is a genuinely honest rendering of the epistemic situation of financial regulators during a systemic crisis. The cash for gold loop is a genuinely accurate portrait of how predatory financial systems targeting vulnerable populations are designed to distribute culpability across a chain of participants who can each claim legitimate commercial function. The arguments hold regardless of the commercial context in which they were produced. Good analysis produced inside a profitable enterprise is still good analysis, but the Sermon on the Mount episode, broadcast 2 days after the $1.5 billion signing, was doing something more than making good arguments about corporate corruption. It was demonstrating, in the specific circumstances of its own production, the final and most complete version of the show's central thesis about capitalism. The thesis, built across 27 years and hundreds of episodes, is that the system absorbs contradiction rather than resolving it. The system does not need the contradiction to be resolved. The system profits from the contradiction being visible because the visible contradiction generates the engagement that generates the revenue. A South Park that made arguments nobody disagreed with would not be worth $1.5 billion. A South Park that made arguments everybody disagreed with would also not be worth $1.5 billion. What is worth $1.5 billion is a South Park that makes arguments that enough people find compelling and provocative and worth watching to sustain a commercial enterprise of that scale. The corporation that pays for the show is paying for the argument. The argument is the product. The product is profitable. The corporation profits from the profitability of the product. The show accuses the corporation of corruption. The corporation broadcasts the accusation. The accusation generates viewership. The viewership generates revenue. The revenue sustains the arrangement. The arrangement continues. Parker and Stone, in their decades of public statements about the show, have been consistent about their awareness of this structure. They have described themselves in various interviews as people who are inside the system they are criticizing and who do not regard their position inside it as a disqualifying circumstance. They have said that being rich does not make someone wrong about the things they are saying. They have said that having a platform provided by a corporation does not mean the criticism delivered on that platform is invalid. These are defensible positions. They are also, in the framework the show itself has built, the exact positions that the system wants its most visible critics to occupy. The most useful critic from the system's perspective is the critic who continues to criticize while remaining inside the system. The critic inside the system validates the system's tolerance. The system's tolerance is a commercial asset. The commercial asset is worth $1.5 billion. This is not a trap that Parker and Stone stumbled into without understanding what they were doing. The show they have spent 27 years writing is a show about exactly this trap. The gnomes are still in the basement. Phase 1 is collecting underpants. Phase 3 is profit. Phase 2 is missing. The missing phase 2 is the moment at which the critic who understands the system becomes the critic who has changed the system rather than simply described it. South Park has described the system with more accuracy and more consistency and more formal inventiveness than almost any other piece of American popular entertainment across the same period. The description is not the change. The description has been collected. constructed, the description has been packaged. The description has been sold back to the population that generated the conditions the description describes, at a price point that the population finds reasonable and that the corporation that owns the distribution rights finds extremely profitable. If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.